Hi everybody, welcome to lecture 22, all about the Neanderthals. So if there was one hominin species that you would have known before this class, I bet it would have been the Neanderthals. So, genus species name Homo neanderthalensis. I will go over how it got that name and also why there is no H here, but there is an H here. So, quite the mystery. Okay, lecture outline is as follows. So first, I will introduce Neanderthals and go over the history of discovery. Next video will cover the anatomy, both the cranial dental and the postcranial, so everything from the neck down. Then I will go over, behavior is going to be presented in three parts. So there's a lot of behavior to cover with Neanderthals. So we see this huge jump relative to archaic Homo in the amount of behavior we see in the archaeological record. And a lot of it is modern and human-like. And so you should see a lot of things that kind of resemble behavior as we even exhibit today. So the first behavior video will cover stone tool manufacture and use, also diet, or Neanderthals hunting or scavenging. Second behavior video covers injuries and health of Neanderthals and burials. So yes, Neanderthals were burying their dead, the first hominin species to definitively do so. And the third and last behavioral video will cover symbolic behavior. Okay, you've seen this figure before. So last lecture I covered archaic Homo, the model in the middle that links Homo erectus on the older end to Neanderthals on the younger end and our own species. For this lecture though, just Neanderthals. And you've seen this figure also. So Neanderthals are here just to show you its temporal range. So Neanderthals appeared in the fossil record 130,000 years ago, and they disappeared and went extinct 30,000 years ago. So we only see them for 100,000 years in the fossil record. This is the spatial distribution. So you could see here that they inhabited Europe and Western and Central Asia. And in fact, they are the first hominin species to not be found in Africa whatsoever. I think that is true. Yes, that is true. They are also the species thus far that have gone the most north. And the more north you go, the colder it is. So Neanderthals had to deal with very different environmental conditions than earlier hominids. And specifically, Neanderthals lived in Ice Age Eurasia. So this is the extent of the ice sheets in Europe. Some of them even overlap some Neanderthal sites. The glaciers overlap some of the sites. And even if they don't, just being at the edge of an ice sheet is a very cold existence. And so because of that, we're going to see a lot of anatomical adaptations within Neanderthals for the cold and also cultural adaptations. So here you can already see some, right? Clothes and fire, and I guess a windbreaker. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with Neanderthals through the negative stereotypes that exist in popular culture. So I have no idea if this commercial predates you, but there was a Geico commercial that used to be a Neanderthal, and the motto was, "So easy a caveman can do it," implying that cavemen and Neanderthals were just stupid. And of course, here's another one from this, I have no idea what this is, like a magazine or whatever, a book, comic, but it shows Neanderthals as violent, brutish, right, hunched over. And so why do Neanderthals get such a bad rap? Do they deserve that? So we'll cover that in this lecture as well. And yes, the main point of this lecture is basically going to be maybe we should give Neanderthals more credit. So you can see here, morphologically, they do look very similar to us, and we'll also see a lot of behavioral similarities as manifested in the archaeological record. Okay, so the history of discovery. The first Neanderthal discovered is at a site called Angus Cave in Belgium, and this is 1829. So this is the first ancient hominin species discovered other than Homo sapiens. And I believe it might actually even be just the first ancient hominin specimen discovered, period. So Angus is in Belgium. Here you can see it on the map. This is what the cave looks like from the outside, and this is the specimen. So the top part of a cranium. It's dated to about 40,000 years ago, maybe, based on the associated archaeology. So remember, this is cultural stratigraphy. It is an 8 to 9-year-old individual, so not an adult. And if you remember from previous lectures, like with the Tong child and Australopithecus africanus, it can be hard to study morphology. It's not as fully manifested in juveniles. And so a lot of the features which distinguish species are not as clearly seen. And so because of that, and remember, this was the same for Tong child. For the longest time, there was a debate whether it was actually a hominin or just some ancient ape. And because of this, this Angus specimen was thought to be human, so not a different species. Second Neanderthal discovered is this one. Very nice cranium, found in Forbes Quarry in Gibraltar in 1848. So you can see here, this is where Gibraltar is, and this is what the quarry looks like. A lot of these earlier specimens, and including the Tong child, were actually discovered when miners were quarrying things like limestone. So miners come across these weird fossils, and if they're lucky enough to recognize them as such and are willing to hand them off to a researcher, that's how we know about them. Otherwise, we would never know about them. And I shudder to think how many hominin fossils have been discarded and never studied because they were just never passed on to a researcher by a miner. But because it was discovered in a quarry and passed off to a researcher, we don't know exactly where in the quarry it came from. There's no context. We don't know which stratigraphic layer it came from, and thus there's no age. And just like with the Angus specimen, the Gibraltar specimen was thought to be a human, so not a different species. Okay, so third time's a charm. So this is a site of Feldhofer Cave in Germany. This one was discovered in 1856. It is located in the Neander Valley, and this is Neander, that translates to Neanderthal in German. But you can see here there's an H. In the early 20th century, Tal became standardized in terms of spelling as Tal, T-A-L. So I believe that THL is also still pronounced Tal, so the H is silent. But Germany, they standardized the spelling, so it became TAL. So that's why Neanderthals, we spell it without an H. But this specimen, whenever you have a specimen ID, those can never change. Same with species names. And that's why there are H's in the specimen number here and in the species name. So this is what was discovered, skull cap called Neanderthal 1. And dated to 40,000 years using radiocarbon dating. That was done more recently. There was no radiocarbon dating in 1856. I believe radiocarbon only became a thing in the 1940s. Okay, so Neanderthal 1, this is the specimen. It's actually more than a skull cap. There's a thigh bone, upper arm bone, part of a pelvis. So yeah, we would call this a partial skeleton. So what do we make of Neanderthal 1, that partial skeleton? Well, there were 3 interpretations back then. One of them was that Neanderthals were a savage and barbarous race of individuals who lived in Europe prior to the Celts and Germans. So it's thought that these were just still Homo sapiens, but an earlier breed, nothing more. And yes, they were savage and barbarous. So even back then, we could see all the negative stereotypes starting. The second interpretation is that Neanderthal 1 represented a group that was pathological. Specifically, they had rickets and arthritis, so these bone diseases. They're pathological humans, and that explained why morphologically they look different than Homo sapiens. And this was put forth by, I think his first name is Rudolf Virchow, who was a famous German anthropologist back then. And the third hypothesis is that this group was represented extinct primitive relative of Homo sapiens. So a different species, which was formerly named Homo neanderthalensis. Again, the H, because the spelling was different back then, and Neanderthal meaning Neander Valley in German. And of course, ensis, that means from. So it wasn't until more discoveries had to be made before doubters were convinced. So here are these two specimens from Belgium. And so it started to become clear that it was more than just pathology, for example. It couldn't have been the case that we just happened to discover individuals that were all pathological. That would be very unlikely. And so yes, Neanderthals then became the first recognized new ancient hominin species within paleoanthropology. And because these were the first fossil specimens of an ancient hominin, we can actually directly observe the morphology of these ancient hominins, whereas before fossils, we could have only inferred them, much like Darwin did, based on living species like humans and our closest living relatives, chimpanzees, bonobos, so on and so forth. So yes, this required more discoveries to convince other researchers that Neanderthals were a different species, very much like the Tong child, right? So if you remember, Mrs. Plez discovered in Sterkfontein that adult Africanus cranium. It required that discovery to convince the paleoanthropological community that Tong child was actually a hominin. Okay, so I went over the history of discovery, right? The different interpretations and hypotheses of what Neanderthal, specifically Neanderthal 1, what that was. Well, now I'm going to go over where did all of these negative stereotypes come from. You could already see some of that in the way some of these researchers wrote about and described and published about these Neanderthal specimens. So the negative stereotypes, especially the ones about the physical appearance, really come from the site of La Chapelle-aux-Saints. I don't know how to speak French. That could totally be wrong. The site in France here, you can see this beautiful skeleton, right? It was buried, has this flexed posture, so the legs were bent, the arms were kind of brought into the body, or at least the right one. So this specimen was nicknamed the Old Man of La Chapelle, and that's because, well, first, it was discovered in 1908, dated to 60,000 years ago, and it was 40 years old. So back then, that was very old, like senior citizen status. Okay, so there was this researcher, Marcelin Boule, who reconstructed and described the skeleton. So this is the time period he did it. That is not when he was born and when he died. Okay, so this specimen had a healed broken rib, arthritis, loss of molar teeth due to old age. So this individual was not well, so to speak. Especially the arthritis caused this individual to kind of stoop over, right? The bones started to kind of, like the spine wasn't really straight, it started to stoop over. And so Boule interpreted this pathology as actual anatomy. So he thought this is what all Neanderthals looked like. And so he described Neanderthals then as dull-witted, brutish, ape-like creatures who walked hunched over with a shuffling gait and bent knees. But actually, all of that was because this individual had arthritis. But he interpreted it as actual anatomy. And so that led to reconstructions like this, right? Bent knee, hunched over, huge brow ridges, and even, we don't know how hairy hominins are because that doesn't preserve, but this artist decided to put on a ton of hair kind of as a way to make it look more ape-like. And here is a diorama of Neanderthals in a 1930s American museum. So you can see here, just they're all hunched over, right? They all look kind of primitive, sad. So that was the impression of Neanderthals and physically, and a lot of that stemmed from Boule's interpretation of the old man from La Chapelle. Okay, so that concludes video 1. Next up, I will go over the anatomy of Neanderthals.